Well, this is the Latin News Podcast, episode 3. I am your host, Richard McCall, here based in Bogota, Colombia. My very special guest this week is Richard Lapa, author, journalist, writer. Most recently, Beef, Bible and Bullets, Brazil in the Age of Bolsonaro. And later on, there will be a book about Lula coming out. So yes, you've got it. We're going to be talking about Brazil. This is Lula 3.0. Richard, welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Nice
to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you. I mean, I used to read all of your articles in the FT, but it's been a few years and you've rebranded yourself as an author. You're out there, spreading the news about Brazil. It's a very hot topic right now, as there's 4 key points as we see it: China, Russia, the economy, political difficulties, and of course, the environment. I just think I should just hand it over to you and say, Lula 3.0, this is a whole different situation this year. This time, 3 months into his term, deeply divided Brazil. His popularity is already dropping. There's no majority in Congress, and there's a sizable fiscal debt. Let's start with point 1. There's too much to talk about, but let's start with point 1, China, Russia.
Yeah, I suppose it's been a really difficult start, really, hasn't it? I mean, if you compare it to 2003, when Lula first came to office, 2007 when he was re-elected, Brazil was riding high, partially, on the back of a commodity boom that was generated by Chinese demand. And I think, one of the elements of the last 20 years really has been the growing importance of China to Brazil. It's the biggest market for Brazil's exports now. And, huge, exports there of soya and oil and iron ore. And very, very important to Brazil. And it's one of the reasons that Brazil's got this very solid cushion of reserves. And, one of the features of the PT government, both under Lula 1 and 2, and then under Dilma Rousseff, was a close togetherness with China. Mm-hmm. Remember, the BRICS were formed in the 2000s, first as a sort of marketing ploy by the investment banks to sell their bonds, and then that idea adapted by the governments themselves to sort of give themselves a brand that was distinct. So I don't think it's too surprising that Lula, in his first few weeks in office, has moved towards, has shown a preference for China. He did go to the United States in February, I think, had a very disappointing result from his meetings there, didn't get as much money as he would have wanted. And they made a lot of this big trip to China earlier this month. There's been, several highfalutin announcements, and behind the scenes, we understand that they are in fact negotiating quite extensive funds from China, mainly through the China Development Bank and through the BRICS Bank, which, of course, interestingly, Lula's successor, Dilma Rousseff, is the new president of.
Yes.
And some of that money will go into the infrastructure program, which is absolutely pivotal for Lula's efforts to get the economy moving again. At the moment, Brazil's economy is still only looking at 0.9% growth, according to the consensus forecast released earlier today by the central bank. So it's not good. It's not good. And as you said in your introduction, his popularity it's not disastrous. This has still got positive popularity, but it's nowhere near as good as his first 2 terms or Dilma in her term in office. And only one president has been worse since the return to democracy in 1985, and that is Bolsonaro, who's marginally worse in March 2019. So there's a big play on China. And really, I think they've gone in quite aggressively with a pro-China and a pro-Russia stance, really, in relation to the Ukraine. And I think this has been, it looks on the surface to have been quite a bad miscalculation. There's been a terrible response to Lula's pronouncements on Ukraine, in which he seemed to be blaming Ukraine for its own invasion, a patently absurd position. It's tantamount to, you can be nuanced about why Russia invaded the Ukraine and the buildup of NATO and so on and so forth, but to phrase it in the way that Lula did seemed to be really fatuous, and it has provoked a storm of response, not just in the United States, but more particularly from European governments who feel the threat of Russia very, very keenly.
Yes.
And the danger here is that, all that Lula gains in China in terms of economic aid, he loses in terms of potential trade, investment links with Europe. And in particular, in that sense, I suppose the great risk is would be a failure to push through the Mercosur European Union trade deal, originally agreed back in 2019, but so far not ratified by the Europeans because of concerns about the Amazon and deforestation. So that brings you, this episode really of Lula going to China, making these slightly bizarre comments in relation to Ukraine, and suffering quite a bit of bad publicity, brings to an end the first 4 months, really. I mean, we're still not into the 5th month of his administration. But I'm talking too long here, Richard. So I think
no.
Bring some order back to the proceedings.
But that's okay. No, that's absolutely. It's fascinating stuff. It just seems so curious. I realize he needs to sort of curry favor from China, but at the same time, he needs to balance it off, of course, with the United States. I mean, these are the two obvious markets, and of course, there is, there's the Russia question. I guess they buy their fertilizers, or what's needed for fertilizers from Russia, and so therefore there's a balancing out. But he sets out his stall to be a diplomat and say, we're not on any side. Surely more diplomatic would have been to say nothing.
Yeah, I think it could have been. I think it could have been much more nuanced in his comments. And he didn't. I mean, the particular formulation of both sides are responsible just doesn't get anywhere close to the sort of the interventionist character of Russia. And but on the other hand, don't forget that Bolsonaro. You mentioned the fertilizer issue. Brazil, I think, gets about 25-30% of its fertilizers from Russia and Belarus, a Russian ally. Bolsonaro sidled up to the Russians as well, and also made some slightly questionable comments in relation to the Ukraine back in February last year. So Lula's not alone in this, but I think he should be, for someone who aspires to be a global peacemaker, who one of his ambitions is, I think, the Nobel Peace Prize, to be to go out in a blaze of glory on the international stage, not just in Brazil. That's what he wants. But I think this sort of mismanagement of the diplomatic effort isn't good. He would probably argue, well, look, last week, when he after he left China, Joe Biden went back to the Brazilians and said, well, actually, I'm going to try and get $500 million for the Amazon fund, not just 50, as I previously promised. And of course, some people are suggesting that is a success for Lula, but I think nonetheless, there's lots of collateral issues here around this, and alienating the Europeans is just not a good thing to do, I think, particularly given Lula's sort of rise and the origins of the PT and its close connections to European social democrats. Back in the 70s, it was a lot of people were saying that the PT were an outgrowth of European social democracy. You had all sorts of German unionists and Swedish trade unionists going to Brazil, encouraging the growth of the PT. And it's a great opportunity, I think, for Brazil to really present its European side. So this is a misstep in that context.
Again, as you say, that link, that's not one that I had thought of. Again, the sort of heritage from Europe. But let's move on then to the economy. We know there's a sizable fiscal deficit, so he's trying to get these huge loans, banking, perhaps to use the word, on a massive infrastructure project. What else can he do?
Well, I think the first and foremost, what Lula's got to do is restore some sort of sense of stability and predictability to the economy, because obviously, he's been left with a terrible mess by Bolsonaro, who ran the economy during 2022 really with one eye on on the election, and really overspent. And left a complete mess. And I think that the government has gone about. I mean, they've got the team at the Ministry of Finance, led by Fernando Haddad, has done some good work in this sense. The fiscal framework that it's still not been approved by Congress, but it was announced in March. Does try to does propose a new set of fiscal targets, does try to bring into order the sort of growing fiscal deficit and start reducing it in perhaps a more realistic way than its predecessor, the ceiling, the teto fiscal, which was introduced by Bolsonaro's predecessor, Michel Temer, back in 2016-17. It's a very rigid framework, and the new one gives a little bit more room for leeway. Now, some people would argue, though, on the other hand, that it puts too much emphasis on raising revenue, and there's far too many hostages to fortune there, and that's in the sense that the government's not going to have the easy ride it thinks it will in getting this extra money, and the markets, therefore, the investors, institutional investors, don't necessarily buy into this because they don't think it's credible. And I think there's a battle there we've got to see. I mean, Haddad's talked about a fiscal reform, a tax reform. He's talked about additional measures. So the jury's out on this one. Okay. They're shaping up in the right way. It's interesting, I think, that Haddad's biggest critics have been on his own left wing from the Workers' Party. And I think that the slightly concerning thing for me is that Lula has, sort of urged them on in many respects. You'd expect, given Lula's record in the 2000s, that he'd be more circumspect, especially when he talks about interest rates. Interest rates in Brazil are high, but it's not the job of the president to be criticizing an independent central bank, because when the central bank starts lowering interest rates, as it surely will, the markets will see it as not credible. They'll say, well, he's doing that because of political pressure. So I think that, again, they've got to be very careful about how they manage this. But I think there is the possibility that this is going to work. And then you've got to get, where's the growth going to come from? Where's the growth going to come from? Where's the feel-good factor going to come from? Which at the moment is kind of lacking in Brazil. You've still got quite high unemployment. It has come down in the last couple of years, but there's still quite high unemployment, tremendous rates of informality, and tremendous, poverty, a reemergence of poverty, really, in the last couple of years. And this is, this will weigh on Lula's popularity. He knows he's got to do something about that. He knows he's got to get, job creation back. And infrastructure is seen as a way to do that. The problem is, at the moment, their infrastructure, they don't have the money to do infrastructure properly. There are literally hundreds of projects. I think they announced something like, no, the numbers escape me, but there's over 100 projects that Rui Costa, Lula's chief of staff, has been titled the father of the infrastructure program. He's got this list of projects, you know, roads and ports, and it's a list of projects, some of which are unfinished, some of which are, you know, just, you know, greenfield sites, whatever. But these things, they have to start this, and it's not clear how that's going to happen even now. The Chinese are quite keen to get involved, but you know, the problem with the Chinese is that, as we've seen elsewhere in Latin America, and I'm sure, you know, your reporters have written about this, it's not a brilliant record, the Chinese in infrastructure. Ecuador, you know, terrible experience with Chinese dams. You know, I know from my own, you know, I've been doing quite a lot of reporting on Bolivia, and some of the Chinese investments there have not been very impressive in the mining sector. And then you've got, you know, you've got this Venezuela, you know, where it didn't happen at all. So, you know, sometimes it does. I mean, there are positive examples too. And Brazil, you have to say that the transmission company State Grid has done a pretty good job by all accounts in the in that sector. So there are good examples, but it's not necessarily you know, a silver bullet, and you need other people involved, and they need to get Brazilian companies involved, Brazilian investors involved, and I think they also need to get other international companies involved.
So I'm curious, you know, as you said, we're in early days. I'm curious, when we talk about all of this, it's upheaval, it's very unsettled. The polarization is probably greater than it's ever been before. I imagine Lula has been blaming it on his predecessor, but he can't do this for too long. And I don't know if it can work, because you know, he only won by the skin of his teeth. How do you feel? I mean, we've got Bolsonaro lurking in the wings. I mean, he's still very much a political figure, immensely popular in the south of Brazil, whereas, you know, Lula is northeast and these areas. And we saw the 8th of January, the insurrection with the broadest, most descriptive possible term. What kind of possibilities do we have of something else happening, or of this type, further aggressions or violence in Brazil?
I think that insurrection is probably not the danger. I think that the danger is the right winning a slow stranglehold in the country and in Congress, really, and blocking Lula. And I think that can happen with Bolsonaro as a kind of rabble rouser, or without Bolsonaro, if he's excluded from politics, as is possible. I think that there's, you know, a lot of people who are allied with Lula. Well, first of all, there's two things really, aren't there? There's the situation in the country. I mean, and essentially, Lula's starting from a somewhat weaker position than he's had before, right? He lost in every state in the south and southeast and centre west. You know, he really only won in the northeast and in some Amazon and in the Amazonian cities, really, in Manaus and in Belém. And you know, so he's starting from a weak position in the country. I don't think he's been helped by the left. I'm thinking particularly recently of the Sem Terra, the landless movements activities, who launched, with the worst possible timing, it must be said, for Lula, a red April, when they started invading productive farms, including farms run by, you know, sort of agricultural properties, I should say, run by Suzano, which is a listed paper company, and by Embrapa, which is a well-respected the state's own agricultural research entity. Now, I don't know why Stedile, who's the head of the MST, was invited to China. And presumably, Lula was, he's keeping the left happy, but this does nothing to calm, anxieties in the south east and particularly in the center west of the country. And there's no surprise that the Pluralistas have been up in arms about it. And, it's reviving fears about, in this, sort of Bolsonarista heartland, really. So that's a real negative. Now, in Congress, I think all this is very delicate. The end of the day, the PT have about a fifth of the 513 deputies in the lower house. And the balance is held by essentially two separate factions, one of which is led by Artur Lira and the other by Rodrigo Pacheco. And I suppose the common feature of these factions is that they are supporting Lula for now, while they think their interests are best served by being part of the government. But, one of the features of the Central is, as Bolsonaro discovered, is that when things get tough, the Central tend to look after their own interests. And that's as true for Lira or Pacheco, or for Henan Calleros, the MDB politician who's also allied with Pacheco and his faction. That is as true for them. And this is a problem for Lula because, if things don't take off, they don't manage to revive the economy, and say we get into this middle of next year and his popularity is beginning to fade badly and fall badly, then they'll be looking at jumping ships. And I've been told that some of these guys in Congress are already thinking of a support for Tarcísio de Freitas, the governor of Sao Paulo, who was of course Bolsonaro's infrastructure minister and is widely touted as being the most likely conservative candidate for president in 2026. And I think the more that, the faction fighting within the PT goes on and Gleisi Hoffmann continues to target Haddad and the more moderate wing of the party, the more likely it is that tensions within this centrist group will grow. And, it's not impossible to imagine them, abroad, them shifting and supporting the right. I mean, I think the problem is that, many conservatives in Brazil don't want another Bolsonaro because they don't want the kind of unpredictability and incompetence that was associated with his administration. Not just him, but his, it was, I mean, a lot of people in the country identified with Bolsonaro, but I think, people in the elite did not. At the end of the day, they felt that actually Lula was probably going to be safer than another round of Bolsonaro.
I see that. There's a great, at least you can fit Lula into the sort of matrix, whereas Bolsonaro you couldn't. I mean, we just didn't know what was going to come next. I'm curious then on that level, is before we get into environment and the Amazon and so on, so where do the middle class sit in all of this then? Because I can only assume right now that Lula's not immensely popular amongst the middle class.
I think Lula, I think a lot of people voted for Lula in the middle class because, and it depends what you mean by the middle class, but I mean, if you think about, because the you know, some people talk about class C, you know, which
Mm.
as a middle class, which is, you know, people are earning, families with earn more than $1,000, which is really more like a working class, but a better off working class. But I'm thinking more about the professional groups, you know,
Okay.
classes A and B, which in a way, in European or American terms, are middle class. And I
Mhm.
think they voted for Lula because they'd had enough of the unpredictability of the Bolsonaro years. I mean, his Bolsonaro's management or mismanagement of the COVID pandemic was a frightening thing for many middle class people. And I think people wanted stability. So, but I think on the other hand, they probably had higher expectations from Lula. I think, you know, and maybe we can go into this a bit on the
Mhm.
thing about when we talk about the environment, but I think people thought that we were getting back to normal, and we didn't want we didn't want the unexpected. And I think, you know, Lula will strain that support because there have been these, you know, I think that he needs to settle things down. I mean, I think he's had one eye all the time on keeping the grassroots, the PT happy. And the thing is about the PT that it has moved to the left, I'm told, since 2016. The grassroots, the PT, you know, really bought into the idea of the impeachment of Dilma and Lula's own imprisonment as a coup attempt, really, as a consummated coup, not a coup attempt. And they were radicalized. And I think that faction of the PT that's always seen the possibility of a broad alliance with, you know, with progressive business groups, and has looked to, you know, build a kind of more European style social democracy, got slightly more, became isolated to some extent, and the left of the FT held the upper hand. I think Lula's, you know, he's appealing to that kind of revanchist
Mm.
sentiment to some extent. They don't believe in the you know, the wealthy are gonna go for a liberal option anymore.
Mm.
But the problem is for these guys that they're nowhere near a majority. There's nothing down for that kind of strategy. You know, a hard left approach in Brazil can't work any more than it can work in Europe or the US. I mean, you go down the road of Jeremy Corbyn or, you know, um, all the other guys who've,
Mm.
you know, gone into that pure ideological purism.
Mm.
Lula's not about that. In his historically, he's not been about that. He's been much more pragmatic, much more sort of sensible, gradual reform. But I think he needs to, you know, at the moment he's very, very keen to keep the PT radicals on side by all appearances, at least. So I think that doesn't help his support with the middle class.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think, and then we, you know, when we talk about this, we talked China, Russia, we talked the economy, the political difficulties, and we need to then move into the environment here and into this final segment of the show. And of course, I think all of these three previous points feather in to environment, the protection of the Amazon. We can all remember the massive fires taking place in the Amazon, the destruction of the rainforest. It's obviously a huge mobilizing international cause. And I think personally, Lula could have put that higher up his list of important topics with which to discuss, you know, internationally and nationally. Obviously, after Bolsonaro's, say, lack of immediate attention to the situation. How do you feel on this topic?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think, you know, before the election, a lot of us were thinking that, you know, this is the great opportunity. There were many reasons for thinking that. I
Mm.
mean, Lula's performance in his, you know, certainly between 2004 and 10, and then in the first couple of years of Dilma's government, was quite impressive on the deforestation front. You know, they empowered the environmental agencies like IBAMA and ICM Bio, there was a lot of intervention, and they really brought down the rate of deforestation very markedly. And so, by 2012, it was, very much less. I think probably about a sixth of what it had been in 2004. It had not been eliminated, obviously, but they'd made huge progress, and they were lauded internationally for that achievement. I think what happened under Dilma is that there was a bit of a drift. There was a bit of a kind of fight back from the agribusiness sector that wanted slightly looser controls, and that did lead to a bit of an increase in deforestation. But obviously, things deteriorated very markedly under Bolsonaro when deforestation took off again. 2021 was a high point. And so Lula comes in beginning of 2023, and the first thing he does is he starts to channel extra budget to IBAMA, ICM Bio. He brings in Marina Silva, who's a very respected former petista, but a person who left the PT and formed her own sort of centre-left party. Got a lot of credibility internationally. He brings her in as environment minister, and some of her old technicos alongside her. In the first month he's in office, he sends in the agencies and the police into Roraima to clamp down on the garimpo, a huge illegal mining operation there, and that wins a lot of international attention. So it's quite a good start. But where are we now? 3 months in, just looking at the numbers today, and deforestation it's this first quarter has been the worst since 2021, and before that the worst since 2008. So it's not good. You need to continue and follow up these things, and I think it needs to be higher on the agenda. That is the great opportunity. Maybe it's early days, and maybe they'll turn around and say, well, actually we are doing quite a lot, it takes time to feed through, and these places, places like Roraima or wherever else, Pará and Amazonas are the worst states in terms of numbers, but you'd expect that they're the biggest states in the Amazon. But these places are difficult to police. There's no question about it. But I do feel that it's not, it's surprising that he's gone out on a limb on the Ukraine, where Brazil has zero influence to all intents and purposes, and not made more of an issue about his green credentials, which would first of all chime in with Biden and the US Democrats and the Europeans. It would help the trade deal with the European Union, and Brazil can do something about it. So it will be a bigger priority. And maybe it's communications, maybe it's happening, and when we will be told that there's new initiatives in that area, and it's there's nothing to think they don't think it's important, but it doesn't seem to be. What can one say?
Well, I like you, I think it could be something if he does. We've had a lot of visuals right when he started. I think the army was up there and so on, and the talk of drones and talk about satellite spotting. As you say, nigh on impossible to police out there. Easier to police, I think, when you're shipping the goods rather than so that the damage has been done. But I just think that were he to create more noise around that, he could start to patch up some of the difficulties created in his, let's say, foreign policy announcements, because I think we would immediately, or people would immediately shift, as you say, the European Union, the US would shift, their interests would shift to, okay, let's do this, let's protect the Amazon and so on. Well, we're coming to an end of this conversation, this episode 3 of the Latin News podcast. I've got 2 further questions, and they're a little bit tricky. So I want to put you on the spot. The first one is, what is your perspective? What is your opinion on the likelihood of the trade deal with the European Union going through?
I can't say, because I don't know. I mean, I would have thought that it's these comments. And the thing is, one of the things that the area's dissatisfaction, it's the European parliaments, right? It's each of the national parliaments that have got to approve it. So you've really got to have a fair win for that to happen. And they are. I mean, the moment the Ukraine comments and the deforestation figures won't help.
No,
but and they said, I mean, actually the Ministry of Development said this in one of the papers today, that they are hopeful that it'll get it done. Well, I'm sure they are, but it's it may be more difficult than it might appear. In my intuitive sense, but I might be wrong. I mean, maybe they're already there. Who knows? But
no, I'm not trying to trap you, though. I'm not trying to get you to say something.
I mean, I just don't know. I just can't say. I mean, I think intuitively you would think that this is become somewhat harder, and not impossible, but it needs some high level attention.
Somewhat harder, exactly. And then finally, we're looking at the polarized Brazil. We're looking at, again, the left losing ground with those, swing voters and, the minimum amount, the issues with the Congress, the issues with the economy. Will Lula see out his term, or will he be ousted beforehand?
So I think it's much more likely than not that Lula will see out his term, because I think the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff set Brazil back. It set the stage for this very damaging polarization that led to Bolsonaro's election in 2018. And I think a lot of people, looking on that, think we don't want to go through that again.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, it's not impossible that Lula could be impeached. Which is the main likely. I don't think there's really. I think the chance of a military coup, it can't be ruled out completely. But I think it's on the whole quite unlikely. I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened already, in a sense. I think it's much more likely that the right will use their power at a local level and a national level to really surround and suffocate Lula's radical instincts. And I think that, one thing we should look at the next year's local elections, when, the Liberal Party, Bolsonaro's party, plan to, they plan to triple the number of mayors they've got. I mean, that's always going to be an interesting indicator of the mood of the country, to the extent to which local government shifts. I think that these movements in Congress are really very, took this sort of breakup of the Lira Central into two, are significant in that sense, because it opens up spaces for the right, and for new alignments. So I think that those are the things to watch, and my suspicion is that Lula or a PT successor, probably Haddad, but again, the jury's probably out. I mean, he's probably the favoured son for Lula at this point in time, but we're a long way away. Other people, I'm sure, will be pressing from the left of the party. I think the likelihood is a conservative win, a centrist centre-right win in 2026 at the ballot box.
So, and the possibility of Tarcísio Freitas, as you said, in Sao Paulo.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just repeating conventional wisdom in a way, but I think that does seem to has a logic to it, actually.
Well, it's as you say, early days, but then that if I could sort of, summarize that last intervention, it's kind of like we are expecting common sense to prevail. Then we don't want the instability of what happened. Did you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. I mean, I just think I didn't think the years between 2016 2022 were very good for Brazil. Um, well, take it further back. The decade 2013 to 2023. I mean, it's not been a good 10 years, and I think people want. I think probably there's a demand for greater stability and predictability amongst those with a stake in society.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes a lot of people who are not that well off, actually.
Yeah.
Because one of the things about the way that Brazil has changed is how, relatively poor people see their futures as in rather individualistic ways. As whether it's as a humble Uber driver or there's a lot of sort of entrepreneurial ideas out there, which aren't necessarily going to go anywhere, right? But it's kind of this idea of Brazil being empreendedor, sort of empresarial is there. People are individualistic in their mindset. It's a conservative country anyway. So it's not sure what that means really, but I think it does mean we're moving probably into a more conservative period, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this. I mean, I know that our listeners will have appreciated all of these comments. I mean, because it's again, the desire, the demand for greater stability and predictability that seems like it will be a major driver in these next few years is Lula 3.0, as we've kind of called this. So, Richard Lapa, let me say thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, and sharing it with us here on episode 3 of the Latin News podcast. Everyone out there, please take a look at Beef, Bible, and Bullets, Brazil in the Age of Bolsonaro. And of course, keep an eye out because at the moment, as yet untitled, but there is a book coming out soon on Lula. So, Richard, thank you for your time.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. Been a great pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. This has been Latin News episode 3. Remember to subscribe. You can find us on all podcast channels. Of course, we're on YouTube as well. TheLatinNewsPodcast.com, our website. And of course, subscribe and check out the Latin news page as well. So thank you for listening. I've been Richard McCall, and this has been the Latin News Podcast. Bye-bye.